What's the first question in the Torah? Well, it depends who you ask. And it depends how we translate one very short two-letter word, af. Af can imply a question, and that's how the Jewish Publication Society, captured in our Eitz Chaim Chumash, that's how it translates it. Now the serpent was the shrewdest of all the wild beasts that the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, af, did God really say, you shall not eat of any tree of the garden? Okay, so we need some background here. The Nahash, the serpent, says this to Eve, who isn't actually named for another chapter. Here she's just the woman. The serpent says this because it's interested in convincing the new humans to do something they've been told not to do. God, a chapter ago, had spoken to Ha-Adam, the first person, the second person having not been created yet, and said, of every tree of the garden you're free to eat, but as for the tree of the knowledge of good and bad, you shall not eat of it, for as soon as you eat of it, you shall die. Then we get the tale of the creation of the first woman, and chapter 2 ends with our heroes enjoying the garden, prancing around naked with no self-awareness, but presumably enjoying the multisensory pleasures of paradise. Chapter 3 introduces a new character, though, and according to this interpretation, the Nahash is interested in manipulating the woman into doing something God had explicitly condemned, eating from the tree of knowledge. So the serpent asks a question, af, did God really say you shall not eat any tree of the garden? The thing is, most Jewish commentators don't read this verse as a question. Rashi says the word af here can mean perhaps, shema, as in, perhaps this God said to you, lo tochlu mikol eitz hagan, don't eat from any tree in the garden. It's a statement. And Rashi continues, and although he saw them eating of the other fruits, yet he entered into a long conversation with her so that she should answer him, and so that he might then have an opportunity to talk about that particular tree. The serpent isn't asking, he's planting an idea, a false idea to which Eve reacts. The woman replied to the serpent, we may eat of the fruit of the other trees of the garden. It is only about fruit of the tree in the middle of the garden that God said you shall not eat of it nor touch it lest you die. So just notice what the serpent is doing in bringing about a conversation, and keep that thought for a point I want to make just a little later on. So what's our problem here with this exchange? Eve never heard the specific prohibition. What was the prohibition? Not to eat from the tree. She was created after God instructed the first human about what's acceptable and what's out of bounds. Either Eve simply extrapolates from Adam's instructions, or Adam himself adds the additional prohibition against even touching the tree. There are other possibilities too, but suffice it to say, the game of telephone leaves an opening for the Nahash. And the serpent said to the woman, you are not going to die, but God knows that as soon as you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, who knows good and bad. A quick aside. The medieval commentators don't think that this means that human beings, from the moment of their creation, are incapable of knowing the difference between good and bad. Nechama Leibovich, the 20th century scholar and master teacher, says both Maimonides and Abravanel agree that it would be inconceivable to explain that the eating of the tree of knowledge implies the achievement of free will and the capacity of intellectual discernment. For man, the product of God's own fashioning, created in his image, could not possibly have lacked this consciousness. So it must be that the knowledge that human beings attain when they eat is a different character of knowledge, a greater level of sophistication, or perhaps evolution. But what exactly was the opening for the serpent? The Midrash suggests, in relaying the prohibition to his wife Adam, Adam was obeying the later rabbinic principle, ve'asu siyag leTorah. One should make a fence around the Torah. The Nachash shrewdly takes advantage of this opening. He touched the tree, says the Midrash, with his hands and his feet, and shook it until fruit dropped to the ground. So the serpent, that at that point has hands and feet, proves that you can indeed touch the tree of knowledge and live. So it must be that you can also eat from it and live. Adam's hedging, intentionally or not, ends up leading to the expulsion from Eden. Make a fence too high, says Bereishit Rabbah, and it may fall and destroy what it's meant to protect. But here's what I want to suggest. I don't think the point of this story is the serpent, not really. Yes, there's an etiology here, which is a fancy way of saying the Torah offers a myth about why snakes don't have legs, and also another myth about why humans have pain in childbirth when other species do not. These are sometimes called pourquoi stories, why stories. Genesis, like all mythic texts, contains these etiological elements, but the real lesson of this exchange is about the evolving relationship between God and humanity and the planet. Which brings me to my original point. What's the first question in the Torah? Because that might tell us something important. For Christianity, apparently, it's the verse we read, because the serpent is Satan and eating the apple is original sin, and the serpent is questioning God's authority by sowing confusion and dissent, creating a rupture that can only be repaired by Jesus. But the text doesn't mention anything about sin. Nowhere in Tanakh, the entire Hebrew Bible, is this act of eating the fruit, which, by the way, is not necessarily an apple, called a sin. And when God responds, yes, there's a punishment, ostensibly, but it's not even clear what the punishment is for. The serpent has to crawl on its belly, but what's the crime? The text says, ki asita zot, because you did this. What's this? Is it speaking falsehood? Is it, which the serpent doesn't really do? Actually, the serpent tells the truth. Is it manipulating a certain outcome? Is it about the tree per se? When the humans are kicked out, it's so they won't eat of the tree of life. But the Eitz Chaim, remember that other tree, was never disallowed in the first place. And the threat of death for eating from the tree of knowledge appears to have been an empty threat. They live. Maybe something else dies. And yes, Eve and other women are going to have pain in childbirth. What could that possibly have to do with knowledge? Now, I'm not one who would too quickly suggest that the Torah is teaching science. I don't think it's usually its job. But in this case, there's something intriguing here. Why do humans have pain in childbirth when this is not typical in the animal kingdom? The answer is that we are in the midst of our evolutionary development. Nature selected humanity to develop in three ways that both ensured our survival and, yes, causes painful baby deliveries. On one hand, we have really big brains. Huge, really. According to at least one biological anthropologist and neuroscientist, our brains weigh an average of 3 pounds, which is enormous for an animal of our body size. By comparison, chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, have brains that are 1/3 the size of our own. Most of this brain size difference reflects the evolutionary expansion of the association cortex, a group of regions that supports such sophisticated cognitive functions as knowledge, self-awareness, and problem solving. I'm a little nervous teaching brain science with Emil Benden to Sal Snyder in the room, but I hope I've got that right. Here's the problem, though. All this sophisticated cognition alone doesn't save us from tigers. For that, we needed 2 additional evolutionary developments: binocular vision, which allows us depth perception unrivaled in the animal kingdom, and bipedal locomotion, which, guess what, frees our hands up to use tools or weapons. Which is to say, we see clearly, perceiving the relationship between objects, and we walk or run, if there's a tiger, upright, which means our hips are narrow. And the problem is that women, God bless them, have to squeeze those huge brains in our proportionally enormous heads through their relatively narrow hips, which, God bless my wife, hurts. So, in fact, the intellectual capacity that comes with our brains in the bodies as we have them does lead to pain in childbirth. How about that? So maybe this sequence isn't really about sin and punishment, but about evolution, about understanding why human beings exist as we are. Viewed in this way, we might better appreciate Ramban's take on the text, Ve'el ishech shukatech, your desire shall be for your husband, which immediately follows the verse about pain in childbirth. Nachmanides, Ramban says, this is an affirmation of the power of human sexual pleasure. Despite the inevitable consequence of pain when babies come, most women still want to have sex. And the Talmud points out that even the bit about pain isn't really so straightforward. The word etzev is not the Bible's typical word for pain. It means something more like sadness. It's like a soul pain. In this vein, the Talmud suggests that the verse is also referring to the challenge of not just birthing, but also raising children, which is incredibly hard and, I think, exceptionally rewarding. We might even consider whether the banishment from the garden is really a punishment per se. After all, God immediately makes fur coats for Adam and Eve. How angry is God really? And while Adam's labor is meant to be harder now, humanity was created and placed into the garden, le'ovda u'le'shomra, to work it and guard it. Humanity, way back in chapter 2, is meant to work the land. That doesn't change with the expulsion. And, of course, it's just before this, before the consequences doled out to the serpent, to Adam and to Eve, that the Torah offers in our normative Jewish understanding its very first question. Here it is. They heard the sound of the Lord God moving about in the garden at the breezy time of day, and the man and his wife hid from Adonai Elohim among the trees of the garden. Adonai Elohim called out to the man and said to him, "Where are you?" Ayeka, the Torah's first question. Why this question? Does God not know where they are? Rashi explains that the whole point of the question is to enter into conversation with them, to try to understand their motivations, to give them a chance to take responsibility for their actions. And guess what? They don't. They deflect. Adam blames Eve, Eve blames the serpent, and then comes the expulsion from Eden. What if this isn't a punishment at all, but what child psychologists call a natural consequence? What if they are simply in need of a new set of circumstances, and this moment is what precipitates the next stage of their evolution as human beings? Where will they learn life's next important lessons? Outside of the garden. Lynn Bechtel writes the following: the evidence demonstrates that the myth is about growing out of the childhood world of the garden, infancy, that is chapter 2, verses 7 through 9, childhood, verses 16 through 20, adolescence, verses 21 through chapter 3:12, early adulthood, verses 13 to 21, and into the adult world that Adonai Elohim created to be populated and cultivated by mature human beings, verses 22 to 24. It is, she writes, about finding identity which does not come from within the individual alone, but within the context of the community, including the earth and the animals. It is about coming to grips with the inherent oppositional forces of life created by God in the beginning, and about coping with death as a natural and essential part of life. It is about maturation, argues Bechtel. Why do we exist in our current form? The text seems to be asking us. What's our relationship to the natural world as inheritors of the earth? What's our responsibility for it as stewards brought into existence at the pinnacle of creation? Where are you? Ayeka is not a geographical question, but an existential one. Rabbi Arthur Green, in his Radical Judaism, expands on this idea. The creative force within being calls out, "Where are you?" to every human being. Surely a call that is not in words and comes from a place deeper than language. I have chosen to read this, he writes, as the call of God from within, the animating spirit of the whole great evolutionary journey, calling out to every human to participate fully in it, each in our own distinctive way. What's the first question of the Torah? It is, as Rashi so powerfully puts it, not a condemnation of a person or a people, surely not a condemnation of a species, but an invitation to a conversation. When we attempt to engage truly with that question, we find answers to some of our own deepest questions. What's life about? Why do we exist? And how can we locate ourselves not in paradise, but in the world as it truly is, with all of its pain, in all of its splendor? Given all of this, another question we might ask: where do we go from here? Shabbat Shalom.